Interpretation Act of Canada. An act respecting the interpretation of statutes and regulations. Enactment means an act or regulation or any portion of an act or regulation. So as you saw in the Canadian Interpretation Act, an enactment means an act or a regulation that has been given force of law through the Parliament. So the Highway Safety Code, the Municipal Taxation Act, the Automobile Insurance Act. These are all codes, acts, rules, regulations, and laws, or enactments, that have been given force of law, that apply to legal persons. All these codes. Public officer. Public officer includes any person in the federal public administration who is authorized by or under an enactment to do or enforce the doing of an act or thing, or to exercise a power on whom a duty is imposed by or under an enactment. So, one more time, public officer includes, look at the word, includes with an S, any person who is authorized by or under an enactment to do or enforce. So, according to the Canadian Interpretation Act, when you check out interpretation section, it says public officer, and it says a public officer includes. Now notice the terminology they're using here. It's an inclusive term. So whatever they're about to state and describe, that's what a public officer is. So it says a public officer includes any person. Any person. So they're saying that any legal person is considered a public officer. Now it says who is under an enactment. Under, meaning that you have to follow it. An obligation to do the act on who a duty is imposed. Imposed. So a public officer is any legal person who is forced to follow an enactment and who the duty of that enactment is imposed upon their legal person. So your legal person and my legal person would be considered a public officer. And that is how they are applying the rules of the acts and the regulations to us men and women, by declaring us to be legal persons in the form of public officers and then imposing the acts and the regulations upon us by saying it's our duty. But truly, we are not public officers, and we have no obligation to follow this law, these acts and regulations. So public officers are public servants. It's just another way of saying it. A mayor, a local city councilman, a policeman, a fireman, these are considered public officers. So if you are a public servant, then you have to follow the acts and the regulations. You have no choice. But we are not public officers. Most of us watching this video, and myself included, we are not public officers. We are men and women who have had legal persons attached to us. So there's no obligation to follow this code. So according to the Interpretation Act of Canada, the only one who is obligated to the acts and the regulations are public officers. Those are the only ones who have to obey those rules and regulations. Now, public officers are considered legal persons. That's what they rendered them in law. And according to the Quebec Civil Code, are human beings, Article 1 in Quebec Civil Code, we possess a legal person. Therefore, we've been rendered through the legal person public officers. So when the police stop you and try to enforce the Highway Safety Code or any type of other code upon you or any type of act or regulation upon you, they're doing it by declaring that you are a public officer, a legal person. And as such, you have a duty to follow these rules and regulations. So, the police pull you over and they try to apply against you the acts and the regulations. What they are acting upon is they're claiming you are a public officer. That's what they're claiming by pulling you over. And remember, Article 794 of the Criminal Code in Lawful Excuse video part 3, it says that he has no obligation to inform you that you are not a public officer. That if you don't invoke that right, that lawful excuse, by informing them that you are not subject to these acts because you are not a public officer, that he'll continue to issue the ticket. So the cop is saying that you're a public officer who is on the job presently, and that you are working as a public officer for Canada, and therefore he has the right to apply the acts and the regulations and make you accept this ticket and bring you into a summary conviction court and try to say that you were an employee, a public servant, working as a public servant, and he fined you for not following the rules of the corporation. So the cop, he wants to issue a ticket to the legal person who they are claiming is a public servant that must obey their acts and regulations. However, if you produce your lawful excuse and show them that you are not a public servant and that you are not a legal person, so they'll have no right to issue you a ticket because you don't have to obey what applies to public servants. And Criminal Code of Canada, Article 794, if you've watched my other video, says you get an excuse, a reason, an exemption why the acts don't apply to you, because you're not a public servant. And you have to inform them of this fact. I'm not a public servant. I'm not a legal person. Therefore, your codes, your enactments, your acts, your regulations, they don't apply to me. And I can't be charged. Now you're under the obligation. It's your obligation to inform them. You have to tell them. If you don't tell them, they will automatically assume that you are a public servant, and they will continue to try and apply, ticket you, and get your money from your pocket. But if you step up and say, excuse me, you're claiming I'm a public servant? Please produce your proof of claim that I was working at the time I was stopped, that I was a public servant, so I should have a paycheck. So please produce your paycheck records or your record of pay to prove that I was a public servant. If you can't produce these records that show that I was operating in the capacity as a public servant for the government at the time you issued me my ticket, leave me alone. Or I'll sue your private court in the Queen's Bench for breaking my rights and trying to declare that I'm a public servant when they have no proof that I was a public servant operating in that capacity. So when you do get in trouble or you do get pulled over, you can start at that point and ask the police officer, well, listen, where's your proof of claim that I'm actually a public servant right now and I'm on the clock? If you don't want to start that type of conversation on the side of the road, just take your tickets under your license and under your registration, and when you get back, send the prosecutor a notice or send the courthouse a notice and ask for the proof of claim that you were indeed a public servant working at the time that these tickets were issued. What you need to understand is that all these acts and regulations, they're just bylaws of a corporation. They don't apply to men and women. They can only make them apply to you if they twist words in the law and make them apply to your legal person. And as you've seen by declaring that you are a public servant and therefore you are obligated and you are under these acts to perform a duty. But they have no proof of claim against you that says you're a public servant working whenever they issue you a ticket. I have a 3-page report or a 3-page letter that can be sent to the courthouse, and it puts them on attention and makes them aware of the fact that you are not to be considered a public servant. So I might give that information, I might not. With my 4 videos that you have here, you can produce your own notice and send it to them with the regulations and the acts, informing them that you are not a public servant and therefore you shouldn't be charged as one.